Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I'm going to be doing a review of volumes 1 to 6 of Hirayasumi by Keigo Shinzo. At the time of the recording of this video, only 7 volumes are out and I have read 6 of those 7 volumes. I'm not going to be talking about individual volumes. This is going to be completely spoiler free because I need to convince you to read this manga. This manga is an absolute breath of fresh air. I've only read a few manga now and those have tended to be fantasy or sci-fi manga, and this was my first slice of life manga, and I have to say it was just the best treat. It was the best surprise that I possibly could have had when I started reading it. I do want to give a special shout out to Cyril for recommending this to me. I never thought that slice of life manga would really be my thing, but there is nothing that chills me more than reading about the lives of interesting people going through day-to-day life, very similar to the way that we go through day-to-day life. And that brings me on to a very brief synopsis of what Hirayasumi is. Now, Hirayasumi, for anybody who doesn't speak Japanese, it means to relax, it means to take time off. To say yasumimasu, that means that I'm going to take a holiday, I'm going to take a break, I'm going to take a rest. So Hirayasumi basically it kind of relates to that. So that already sets the tone of what this manga is about. It's very slow, it's very intimate, and we really get a sense of each of the characters and where they are at in their lives and where they want to be going as well as we progress throughout the manga. We follow one main character who goes by the name of Hiroto. And Hiroto is a 29-year-old man, and he is very atypical in Japanese society because he doesn't work for a big company, which is very typical for men, particularly in Japan. It's very, very common that you go to a big Japanese company and you stay at that Japanese company for the entirety of your career. That is a very common career path. If you know anything about Japanese society, if you've watched any movies, you might be aware of the term salaryman, and that is very much a Japan specific term. And the whole concept of a salaryman, again, it kind of relates to that idea of somebody who works at a big Japanese company. They're working there probably very long hours and their whole life is kind of consumed by their job. But the good thing about that is that it provides stability and there is a level of positive recognition that comes attached to that as well. So if you are somebody who falls into that category of a salaryman, then even though there's probably quite a negative perception of it in Western society, there is a positive side to it because it also means that you probably have a job for life, and that stability is obviously seen as a very positive thing in Japanese society. Now, I mention this because Hiroto is the complete antithesis of that. He doesn't have a full-time job and he's kind of living life in a way that is very abnormal for somebody in that type of society. He has a part-time job and he doesn't have this kind of same sense of stability that one would expect of a 29-year-old man in Tokyo. He is kind of just doing things the way that he wants to be doing them. And the interesting thing about that is that he is extremely happy for it because he has that flexibility and he has the ability to really make connections with the people that he cares about most. So whilst this manga is very much a slice of life manga, it's also quite an interesting commentary on how Japanese society is and Hiroto's place in that, and how he is a really interesting contrasting point to what is very typical in Japan. So whilst the manga is focused on him and him being the kind of central point of it, it is also the story of all of the other characters that he interacts with. Now, the kickoff point of this manga, and this is not a spoiler, you see it in the blurb for the very first book, he meets this very stern yet lovely old lady who he develops a friendship with. And it's at that point that this manga really picks off after he meets her. That meeting, one could argue, changes his life and changes the direction of his life. And it also serves the basis by which he builds his other relationships on as well, which I think was really impactfully done. And we're only starting to see the beginnings of that in these first couple of volumes. That brings me on to the rest of the characters. I'm not going to mention any of the characters by name because, again, I don't want to spoil it. And I think this is the sort of manga that you should really just embrace it for what it is and read it as it comes. But the characters are so well done. They are all people that we could all know in our own lives. We have Hiroto's little cousin. She is a fantastic character. She has dreams of her own, but she doesn't really know where to begin. We have his best friend who is around the same age as him. He's married, and so we hear the kind of perspective of his best friend and how marriage isn't necessarily what he thought it would be. And that's quite an interesting angle to explore. We also have another female character who is a bit of a Korea woman, but at the same time, by focusing on her career, she hasn't necessarily spent the amount of time that she would have liked on relationships. And so we see her kind of working through that and meeting people. So every single character, and there are more than that, but those are just kind of 3 examples of other character types that we have. There's such a great cast of characters who are all at different points in their lives and who have all achieved different things and gone through different things. And we're seeing that all through not only the lens of Hiroto, but through each of the other characters as well. And Hiroto, while he is the kind of unifying point of all of these characters, we get a real good sense of who these characters are, where they've been and where they're going. Or we're only really starting to see the beginning of that, given that we're so early on in the manga, but we are starting to see where they're going to go. And it's just such a beautiful experience seeing these characters recognize what they really want and then try to figure out how they're going to work towards that. It's just super enjoyable to read. Like, it's really, really beautiful. I cannot stress that enough. It's so nice to see people succeeding in life, and it's so nice to see people who maybe haven't had everything go their way pick themselves up and try to keep fighting the good fight. It's extremely, extremely heartwarming. Also, a secondary impact of that is that it's semi-motivational. It just makes you realize that you are not the only person that has hard knocks. Every single person has probably had a hard knock. Yes, some may have had more than others, but the point is that that is a unifying thing to all of us, is that we've all had moments where we've had to kind of rise to the challenge, and we really see that represented in every single character. I'll leave it there with characters, because otherwise I could genuinely go on for hours, because each of the characters deserve like a video on their own, but I'm not going to do that, given that I don't want to give any spoilers. But the next thing I'll talk about is the world building and the world that we're in. We are in Tokyo, and the setting, I think, plays a really key part of this story. I don't think it slaps you in the face necessarily, but I do think Tokyo is a character in itself, and we see Tokyo through each of our characters' eyes. We see it through Hiroto's eyes, and he sees it almost like his playground, and he sees it as something not to be subsumed by. It's not something to be completely absorbed in by, which I really, really respect. I think when people go to like really big cities like Tokyo or New York, to some extent even London, they really take it into the point where it kind of becomes their identity, which I personally don't think is a good thing. And one of the many things I love about Hiroto is that he sees it as something that he can use to better himself, but not be totally consumed by it. And I do think that is because he is somewhat distanced from it, because he's not working full time in the city and he's not in this office job at all hours in the day. Like, he gets to see Tokyo through a different light, and I think in a way that helps him kind of stay very level-headed. We also see it through the lens of other characters as well. Like, as one of the characters that I mentioned earlier was Hiroto's little cousin. She is at school, and so we see it through the lens of her eyes. She's very young and she's quite naive and quite innocent. So she sees the city through a very different lens. It's almost quite threatening, and there is a sense of fear when she goes into the big wide world city, which would obviously be the case if you were that age and you haven't been around that much in a big city like Tokyo by yourself. So we really get to see how the environment also impacts each of these people and how they utilize the environment in a way that serves them best. I think it's very nuanced, and I don't think it's super obvious the way that Shinzo does it. But I think if you're paying attention to it, you can really pick up those little cues, and it adds an extra layer to the overall story. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is themes. The themes in this manga are just so good, and I think that's why it really resonates with me. I think that's why it's without a doubt one of my favorite pieces of fiction that I've read so far. I mean, we are very early on in the journey. I don't know how many volumes there are going to be, but I mean, even in these 6 volumes that I've read personally, the themes just resonate so much. And I think you can probably already get a sense based on what I've said, with our main character being somebody who's very atypical in terms of how he operates his job, how he lives his life. He is all about his relationships and his friendships, his family, and like really investing in those relationships, because that's what really matters to him, compared to other people who are much more focused on, their job and money and stuff like that. And that's not to say those things aren't important, because that does come up quite a few times, that Hiroto doesn't necessarily have the means to do every single thing that he wants to do. But at the same time, he's able to create really meaningful experiences that aren't contingent on money and having certain materialistic items, as an example. But there is this really interesting, as I said, commentary, I think, that is quite subtle in this manga, that you don't have to do the salaryman way of life to live a rich life. Hiroto lives a richer life than any of our other characters, and yet he doesn't have tons of money, and yet he doesn't work a full-time job, and yet he doesn't have tons of stability, but yet he lives an incredibly rich life, not only because of the relationships that he has, but also because of the impact that he has on those people at an individual level. And that's what I think makes this character and this manga in general very special. Hiroto is a very, very special individual because he's able to give himself in a way that a lot of the other characters could only wish to do. And that's because he's willing to sacrifice certain things that society respects. But you can tell he deeply respects himself, because what he's decided to prioritize are the things I think a lot of people would like to prioritize, but they don't know necessarily how to, and they don't know how to juggle that with society's expectations and with what society determines is a successful life. And yet Hiroto has already created his own definition for that and lives by that completely unapologetically. And it's just so refreshing to read. It is a beautiful message to give. Like, it really is. And as somebody who is, very ambitious, I've worked a lot in my life, and I've worked extremely hard, sometimes to the detriment of my own health and my own relationships, which I will never ever do again. And I'm glad I went through that, because it made me then reach certain conclusions that I never would have reached if I hadn't gone through that. And I'm glad I also went through it when I was very young. But it does make me think Hiroto is the one that has got it right. He's the one that has got his priorities right. And as always, there is a balance that one can get that means that you can live a meaningful life whilst also not working a job that is going to destroy you, and that will hopefully pay you a decent living wage. That is hard to find, but it is possible. And he shows that through the life that he lives. Yes, he doesn't live the most glamorous life, but he has a life that is rich of memories and friendships and relationships, and it's just such a beautiful message. Like, genuinely, it's really, really heartwarming to read. And I think especially when you contrast that with what Japanese society is like, especially what it was like in the 90s and the early thousands, I think it's starting to change now with younger generations coming up and wanting different things for their lives. But it was very, very typical that you leave university, you go to a job for the next 40, 50 years of your life, you stay there, and you slowly maybe make your way up the ladder, and you get more money and you get more prestige. But that's basically it. He completely puts that on its head, and it's just so refreshing to read, because that also exists in Western societies too. Your value is based on your salary and the type of job that you have and the types of things that you have. And that shouldn't really be the way that it is. It should be what your character is about and how you make people feel and what emotional value you bring to the world, rather than the tangible value that you bring to the world, if that makes sense. So it's just, I think it tackles that in a really delicate way. And again, we're only seeing the start of that, given that we're only so early on into the manga, and I just can't wait to see how that evolves. And it's just such a beautiful message, in my opinion. And I think it does it in a way that I think even if you're not Japanese, it will still deeply resonate with you, especially if you come from a Western society where we tend to value the same things as a culture like the Japanese culture. So absolutely fantastic. I think this manga is the sort of manga that if you want to kind of be taken out of your own life, but then read characters who feel deeply relatable and talk about things that impact every single one of us, then I think this is the sort of manga that you should pick up. I also recommend this particularly for people who are going through a particularly difficult time or a particularly busy time, because it just takes you out of yourself. Like, you really just, you're forced to slow down. You're forced to think about each of these characters, and you're forced to kind of then think about that in relation to your own position. So it's also almost quite philosophical, because you're thinking about how you would respond to the situations that Hiroto and the other characters have to respond to. And it just kind of forces you to take a pause. And that's what I love about this manga so much, or one of the many things that I love about this manga so much. So if I haven't convinced you and you need more, feel free to ask me any questions down below, but I don't know how this couldn't have convinced you. I think a lot of you who watch my channel, we tend to read a lot of the same stuff, right? Some pretty intense stuff. And while I think that's great and there's always a place for that, I think it's also good to read stuff that kind of forces you to slow down a little bit and look at things in a slightly different way and think about things that affect every single one of us in a way that also forces us to remove our individual selves from it. Like, it's just so fantastic, and I strongly recommend it if you didn't get that through this 19-minute video. So let me know down below if you do have any comments. Let me know as well if you have read it. I know Cyril will probably comment in this video, but if there's anybody else who has read it, let me know down below, because I'd love to talk about it with you. I'm so excited to read volume 7 soon, but then I will have caught up, and I'm so sad because then I have to wait like everybody else to get the next volume. But I can't wait. I'm just so excited. It's just the most beautiful manga, and you have to read it if any of that resonated. So if you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in my next one, folks. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, take care, and I will see you very soon. Bye.